processing disorder, and a host of other significant issues, Lamar was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder at the age of 36. He lives in Noonan, Georgia with his wife and children. And today, Lamar will be talking to us on a topic called Let's Trade Shoes. Welcome, Lamar.
Well, let's get the elephant out of the room and let's address the obvious. This guy is wearing yellow shoes. I'm known as what is called a sneakerhead, which means I collect shoes. And I wear my favorite shoes to help me oftentimes with my sensory issues and social anxiety, especially when I have to travel. If you've ever traveled through Atlanta, then you know that that airport is a sensory nightmare. But when I was a kid, I wanted to wear shoes of my favorite athletes because it created a proximity and it made me believe that I could trade lives with them. Now, I have to admit that I fell woefully short in both stature and skill set to becoming the next Michael Jordan. But I've learned that shoes are an incredibly important part of my ministry as a pastor and as a person with a disability. And dare I say that shoes are also an incredibly important part of your ministry as well. Paul talks about shoes. He says, "My dear friends, what I would really like to do is you to try to put yourselves in my shoes to the same extent that when I was with you, I put myself in yours. You were very sensitive and kind then, and you did not come down on me personally. You were well aware that the reason I ended up preaching to you was that I was physically broken, and so prevented me from continuing my journey. I was forced to stop with you." In other words, Paul is saying that sometimes when you live with a disability, your body makes choices for you that you yourself wouldn't choose. He says, "That is how I came to preach to you, and don't you remember that even though taking in a sick guest was most troublesome for you, you chose to treat me as well as you would have treated an angel of God, as well as you would have treated Jesus himself if he had visited you. What has happened to the satisfaction that you felt at that time? There were some of you who then, check this out, if possible, would have given your very eyes to me. That is how deeply you cared. And now have I suddenly become your enemy simply by telling you the truth? I can't believe it." And Paul shares with us what may have been the thorn that he talked about in Corinthians. I don't know if you caught what he said. He says that some of you were so kind to me that you would have given me your eyes if you could, which meant that Paul was acknowledging that he had some form of visual impairment. In fact, it was so severe that it was the reason why he stopped in the province of Galatia in the first place. Paul said that I didn't even intend to stop here, but my disability, because my body makes choices for me that I wouldn't choose, caused me to have to stop here, and I'm going to make the best of my time with you. You know, there are 61 million people in the U.S. with disabilities. And that's just between the ages of 18 and 35. That doesn't count children with disabilities. It doesn't count those who are 65 or older who have what we know as age-related disabilities. And it doesn't even count those who are countless number of people who have gone undiagnosed like myself. But what Paul is advocating for is the intentional acknowledgement that the world that we live in is radically different for those with disabilities, and he invites us to enter into a world that is often insensitive and ill-prepared to accommodate them. Paul says, what I want for you is to put yourself in my shoes to the extent that I have had to put myself in yours. In fact, Paul says that he, through no choice of his own, has been forced to wear shoes of a world that is not quite accessible for people like him. A few years ago, in the Atlanta area, and I can remember this vividly because it was during March Madness and there were a string of tornadoes that came through Georgia. And I remember it vividly because a tornado actually went through downtown Atlanta where they were having the March Madness tournament and destroyed sections of downtown. Now, my family and I, at the time, we lived north of Atlanta, and we also experienced tornadoes. And I can remember it vividly because our oldest son was perhaps maybe 2 years old at the time. And as the house began to shake and the lightning began to strike and the thunder began to roll, I could hear running across the hall a pitter-patter of little feet on the wood floor running towards our room, and he bust the door open like he was the police and jumped in our bed. And I grabbed him in my arms and looked him in the eye, and he said, and I quote, "Daddy, there's a tiger outside my window." And I said, "No, son, it's not a tiger, it's thunder." And he was adamant, "No, Dad, there's a tiger outside my window." And so I immediately started to think, I'm failing as a father. I can't even get my son to understand the difference between thunder and a tiger. And he was adamant, "Dad, there is a tiger outside my window." And after arguing with him for about 5 or 6 minutes, it hit me that in that moment, my calling was not to correct him, but my calling was to compassion. See, conferences like this often empower us to get great coaching, and you'll undoubtedly receive that this weekend. Many of us also come because we're in search of curriculum. And I have no doubt there are great people here that I've been friends with for years who can provide you with that. Conferences like this also help us to come to gain a sense of confidence in being able to go back to our churches and do the work of disability ministry. And I have no doubt with all of the terrific speakers here that you will leave here with a sense of confidence that you are built for this type of ministry. And we also often come to conferences like this because we want to leave with a certain level of competence. That I want to be trained, I want to be educated, I need to get the skills that are necessary so that when I go back to my home church, I feel confident and competent in my ability to serve the needs of the disability community. And we also come to build, let's be honest, our catalogs and to expand our community. And there's no greater conference for that to take place than to come to Inclusion Fusion, where you can meet great people and network and build your catalog and extend your community of those who are also doing this extraordinary work. But what remains central to this calling is to surrender to a Christ-like compulsion to compassion. To acknowledge that the world that we live in isn't built for people with disabilities, and the shoes that they wear are dramatically different because of it. But if the coaching and the curriculum and the community and the catalog of names and services that we collect at this conference are going to make any difference at all in the lives of persons with disabilities, then our greatest commitment and our grandest calling is not just to be trainers, but to learn to be traders. This is Paul's plea, to trade shoes. To trade shoes, Paul says, with me, who has a visual impairment to the same extent to which I have had to trade shoes with you. In other words, Paul is saying, for once in your life, I want you to understand what it's like to be me. This is Paul's plea to trade shoes, but this is also God's pattern. In Matthew, Jesus tells a story about how faithfulness to this calling will be measured. You know this story. Matthew chapter 25, for I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you invited me into your home. I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was sick and you cared for me. I was in prison and you visited me. Then the righteous ones will reply, Lord, when did we ever see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink, or a stranger and show you hospitality, or naked and give you clothing? When did we ever see you sick? Or when did we ever see you battling a chronic illness? Or when did we ever see you living life with a disability or in prison and visit you? And the king will say, I tell you the truth. When you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you were doing it to me. Paul's plea is to trade shoes, but it's also God's pattern to trade shoes, to trade places. Because Jesus says that he traded places with those who were on the margins, those who were hungry and thirsty and in prison, and those whose lives were impacted by some form of physical limitation. Now, I thought what would be cool is to do a group exercise where I would separate the sheep from the goats. And I would ask those in the audience and maybe even those at home to have all the goats to go on the left and all the sheep to go on the right. The problem is that goats are stubborn and none of us would move. Just nudge your neighbor and say your horns are showing. Jesus says that this is how our faithfulness to submit to the compulsion of compassion will be measured. And he measures the faithfulness of his followers by making a note of those who trade in their sympathy for those on the margins with service to and solidarity with those whom society has pushed aside. Yeah, it's Paul's plea. I want you to put yourself in my shoes to the same extent that I've had to put myself in your shoes. I want you to know what it's like to live with a visual limitation. I want you to know what it's like to live with a physical limitation. I want you to know what it's like to live with chronic illness. I want you to know what it's like to be me, because Paul is sharing with the church in Galatia that to some extent I have always had to live in a world that is not friendly to people with disabilities. And this is Paul's plea, but it's also God's pattern. So we're not just here to tell stories and to teach strategies and to talk sensory rooms. We're here to receive training in trading, because we serve a God whose specialty is trading places with people who are on the margins. That's where Jesus says he can be found, amongst those who society has pushed out on the margins, those who are incarcerated, those who are sick, those who are hungry, those who live with physical limitations. If you are looking for me, Jesus says, I have traded places with those people. We serve a God whose specialty is trading shoes. We serve a God who trades beauty for ashes, who trades joy for mourning, who trades salvation for our sin. And in the incarnation, we see a God who walks in our shoes in order to work on our souls. See, Jesus traded the streets of heaven for the souls and shoes of humans. It's not just my plea to put yourself in the place of those who live with disabilities. And it's not just Paul's plea to put yourself in the shoes of those who live with disabilities. It is God's pattern to trade places with those whom society has forgotten. And dare I say, we are never more like Jesus than when we are trading shoes and trading lives. Because after all, Jesus shows us that life change happens when lives are exchanged. Thank you.